Hello everyone, and welcome to my Soap Twist 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Brooke Logan sat on the edge of her velvet couch, hands clutched tightly in her lap and manicured nails pressing into her palms. The air felt heavy and stifling, like if the walls were closing in. Her heart pumped, every beat a reminder of the betrayal that had just been revealed. She knew there was something amiss the instant Ridge walked through the door that evening. His usually warm and steady gaze avoided hers. His broad, confident shoulders fell, as if they were carrying an invisible weight. Brooke had loved this man for decades, forging a life with him through every trial, terror, and triumph. She believed she knew every detail of his soul. But Rich Forrester was a stranger tonight. "Brooke," he murmured, his voice low, nearly whispering. "We need to talk." Those 4 words shattered her world. She could still hear them, reverberating in her head like a funeral bell. Rich sat across from her, his hands fidgeting, and confessed. He'd slept with Taylor. Taylor Hayes, the woman who had always cast a shadow over their marriage, a ghost who haunted the corners of their past. Taylor was now pregnant. Brooke's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, jagged thing that wouldn't let go. She stared at the rain, attempting to focus on something other than the searing ache in her chest. Pregnant. The word seemed like a blade, digging deeper with each repetition. Ridge, her Ridge, had crossed a line that she never expected him to cross again. Not after all they'd gone through. Not after the promises, the vows, and the years spent striving to keep their love alive. She stood abruptly, her silk robe falling over one shoulder as she strode around the living room. Her blonde hair, which was usually precisely styled, flowed loose and wild, reflecting the confusion within her. How could he accomplish this? How could Ridge, the man who said she was his destiny, betray her so completely? And Taylor, who had always played the saint, the martyr, the one who claimed to want peace, how could she have allowed this to happen? The door crashed open, stunning Brooke out of her reverie. Thomas strode in, his face a mask of rage. His dark hair was drenched from the rain, and his eyes burned with such intensity that Brooke's heart hurt. Thomas, Ridge's kid, had always been complicated, loyal to his father, protective of his mother, Taylor, but also inextricably linked to Brooke in ways that made their family a tangled web. Tonight, however, his rage was not focused at her. "Dad told me," Thomas said, his voice quivering with wrath. "He told me everything." "How could he have done this to you?" "To whom?"
"Mom."
"For all of us?" Brooke's lips parted, but no words emerged. She wanted to console him, to be the strong, nurturing stepmother she had always aspired to be, but her own anguish was too intense. She slid back into the couch, her hands quivering. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "There is nothing to say." Thomas paced, his boots leaving wet marks on the hardwood floor. "He's my father, and I've always looked up to him. But this is unforgivable. And Mom, God, Mom is acting like it's a miracle, as if this baby will solve everything. It is a disaster." Brooke's heart twisted at the mention of Taylor. She could see her now, placid and poised, her calm attitude hiding the chaos she had helped create. Taylor had always been the polar opposite of Brooke, calculated where Brooke was passionate and reserved where Brooke was daring. Nonetheless, they had always found themselves battling for the same man, their lives entwined in a never-ending dance of love and rivalry. "Thomas," Brooke murmured, holding her voice steady. "How does your mother handle this?" Thomas stopped pacing and clenched his fists. "She acts as if it's fate. This feels like a second chance for her and her father. She talks about the kid as if it's a blessing, but all I see is the mess it'll make. She doesn't get it, Brooke. She doesn't understand how this affects everyone." Brooke nodded, her throat tightening. She understood Thomas's rage and sense of betrayal. She felt it, too, but it was tinged with a deeper sadness, a loss for the life she believed she'd secured. She had battled so hard for Ridge, their family, and the hope of a future free of the past. And now that dream lay shattered at her feet. The rain continued to fall, a constant rhythm against the silence that separated them. Brooke felt a stab of shame as she gazed at Thomas, whose face reminded her of Ridge. She had always attempted to be a bridge between Thomas and his father, to fix the rifts in their relationship. But she wasn't sure she could mend anything, not for Thomas or herself. "I need to see him," Brooke said abruptly, jumping up. "I need to hear it from him again." "I need to know why," Thomas said, his eyes softening briefly before returning to wrath. "He does not deserve you, Brooke. He never has." The words struck her harder than she expected, revealing a fact she had buried beneath years of love and hope. She grabbed her coat, her motions jerky, and walked toward the door. "Stay here," she instructed Thomas. "I'll be back." The trip to Ridge's studio was a whirl of rain and headlights. Brooke grasped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She had no idea what she was going to say when she met him, or whether there were words to describe the betrayal she felt. But she longed to see his face, gaze into his eyes, and locate a piece of the man she loved. When she arrived, the studio was softly lit, with the usual aroma of fabric and coffee in the air. Ridge stood near the window, his silhouette visible against the metropolitan skyline. He turned as she arrived, his face a mix of remorse and resignation. "Brooke," he murmured with a sad voice. "I didn't want you to find out like this." She snapped, her voice breaking. "How did you want me to know that you slept with Taylor? Is she carrying your child? Were you planning to hide it forever?" Ridge trembled, and Brooke saw the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago, vulnerable, human, and flawed. But the moment passed, and the weight of his betrayal fell back between them. "It wasn't planned," he said, his words cautious. "That was a mistake, Brooke. A moment of weakness." Brooke laughed bitterly. "We were talking about everything we've been through, and it just happened." "A moment of weakness." "Ridge, we have constructed our lives around promises, on trust. And you tossed everything away for a moment?" "I know I messed up," he added, taking a step closer. "But, Brooke, I adore you. I always have. This does not change that." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "It changes everything," she said. "You can't do this and claim it doesn't matter. You don't get to shatter my heart and ask me to forgive you." Ridge reached for her, but she backed away, shaking her head.
"Don't," she replied.
"Don't touch me." The silence afterwards was deafening. Brooke felt the weight and finality of it. She'd spent her entire life fighting for Ridge, believing in their love despite all odds. But this was a wound too deep to mend. "I need time," she finally stated, her voice barely audible. "I need to figure out who I am without you." Ridge's face fell, but he did not protest. He knew her well enough to recognize when she made up her mind. Brooke turned and walked out, the rain soaking her as she stepped into the darkness. She did not glance back. Back at the mansion, Thomas remained seated on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up as Brooke entered, his gaze searching her face for answers she lacked. "Has he explained?" Thomas inquired. Brooke shook her head and peeled off her wet coat. "There is nothing to explain. He made a decision, and now we all have to live with the consequences." Thomas stood, his mouth clenched. "I am going to see Mom. I need to figure out why she feels this is okay." Brooke agreed, too fatigued to protest. She watched him leave, the door gently closing behind him. She dropped to the floor, her back against the couch, and burst into tears. They were hot and persistent, each carrying a piece of the life she imagined she'd have. The days that followed were a haze of anguish and bewilderment. Brooke avoided Ridge by staying in the guest home to create distance between them. She immersed herself into her job at Forrester Creations, but every design, every sketch, made her think of Ridge. The enterprise they'd created together was a tribute to their love, but it suddenly felt like a mausoleum. Thomas, meantime, struggled with his own rage. He confronted Taylor, demanding explanations, but her calm assurances just added to his frustration. "This baby is a gift," Taylor stated, her voice quiet but forceful. "Your father and I have a history, Thomas. This is not about harming Brooke. New beginnings? Thomas scoffed. You are pulling our family apart, Mom. Don't you see this? Taylor's eyes glisten with tears, but she stood firm. I love your father, Thomas. And I adore this baby. I'm not going to apologize for that. Thomas left her house feeling even more lost than before. He loved his mother, but he couldn't reconcile her decisions with the suffering they caused. And Brooke, who had been a constant in his life, flawed but steady, deserved better. He found himself driving back to her mansion, needing to check on her and feel less alone in his fury. When he arrived, Brooke was seated on the patio, a glass of wine untouched on the table near her. Although the rain had stopped, its aroma lingered in the air. She looked up as Thomas approached, her eyes hot but dry. Are you okay? He asked, sitting across from her. Brooke gave a little sad grin.
No.
But I will be. Thomas nodded, sensing more than he could express. I don't know how to fix this, he said. I'm not sure how to make sense of it all. Brooke reached out, her hand covering his. We don't need to fix it, Thomas. Not yet. We just have to keep going. They sat in silence, the city spread out in front of them, its lights a reminder of a world that continued to move even after theirs had stopped. Brooke thought of Ridge and the life they'd created, and she felt a spark of something new. Not hope, not yet, but resilience. She had been through heartbreak before. She would make it through this. Thomas, too, experienced a transformation. His rage remained, a ferocious fire that would not go out, but underlying it was a commitment to defend the people he loved, Brooke, his mother, and even the brother he had not yet met. He had no idea what the future contained, but he was determined not to let it break him. As the weeks grew into months, Brooke began to rebuild. She plunged herself into her crafts, putting her pain into every stitch and seam. Forrester Creations became her safe haven, a place where she could be more than Ridge's wife, a woman wronged. Brooke Logan was a force in her own right, and she refused to let this define her. Ridge attempted to contact her, leaving voicemails that she did not reply and sending flowers that remained unopened. Taylor, too, reached out, her texts filled with apologies and explanations that Brooke was unprepared to hear. Thomas became her anchor, checking in every day, his own troubles matching hers. They depended on each other, two people caught in the ruins of a family they'd each attempted to keep together. Brooke stood on her balcony one evening as the sun began to set, gazing out at the city she had called home for so long. The agony was still there, a persistent ache that never went away, but it was quieter and less intense. She felt a peculiar sense of tranquility as she thought of Ridge, Taylor, and the baby on the way. Not forgiveness, not yet. Rather, acceptance that life would carry on. Thomas joined her, his presence constant and soothing. You're stronger than you know, he added softly. Brooke gazed at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. So are you, she said. They stood there, watching the city light up against the dusk, two survivors of a storm that had permanently altered their lives. The future remained unclear, but for the first time in months, Brooke felt prepared to face it. Not because the anguish had subsided, but because she felt she could handle it. And somewhere in the distance, the rain began to fall again, a gentle whisper of regeneration. Brooke felt her chest tighten as the words sank in, words that were too harsh to be true, words that tore the earth from beneath her. Ridge had not only betrayed her, but also Taylor, a woman who had remained in the background of their relationship for years. The confession came not as a sweet murmur of remorse, but as a harsh reality she had not anticipated. He had been with Taylor, he had crossed a boundary that could not be undone, and now there was a kid growing inside Taylor's body, a child who would forever remind Brooke of everything she had lost in that single moment. She couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded so hard that her eyes blurred, and for a long time, she just stared at Ridge, as if he were a stranger. This was not the man she had loved, the man she had repeatedly forgiven, and the man she believed was inextricably linked to her soul. This was someone else, capable of injuring her in the most intimate and deadly way possible. Tears burnt her eyes but didn't fall. She felt too hollow for that, as if her body had been stripped of everything save a tempest of wrath and sadness churning deep within her chest. Ridge's face was tight, his forehead pinched with guilt, but that didn't matter to her. What good was shame if he'd already destroyed her? She wanted to scream at him, claw at him, and ask how he could do this to her after everything they had gone through, after all the promises he had whispered into her ear, when the world looked so fragile and unsure. But the words remained in her throat. Yes, there was anger, but the grief was stronger, and it caused her to tremble from head to toe. Taylor had always been a presence in their lives, a figure Brooke couldn't completely escape. She had tried to ignore the tension, the lingering glances, and the quiet competition that simmered beneath every conversation. Taylor had her own history with Ridge, which Brooke attempted to respect, but it was a continuous thorn in her heart. And now the thorn had curled deep into her flesh, tearing her open. Taylor was pregnant. Taylor carried a child who should never have been, conceived as a betrayal that mocked Ridge's every commitment. Brooke wanted to despise Taylor with everything she had, but loathing felt insufficient. What she felt was more complicated, a toxic combination of rage, envy, despair, and heartbreaking loss. Taylor had won something that Brooke could not take away. No matter how much she raged or how far she ran, that child would exist. Ridge, the man who had promised her forever, had given Taylor something more enduring than promises, a kid. Thomas had not taken the news well either. He was Taylor's son, fiercely protective of Mom and open about his dislike for Brooke. When he realized what had happened, his rage surged like wildfire. His rage was not focused at Taylor, nor could it ever be, but at Ridge for what he perceived as weakness and betrayal, and at Brooke for ever being in his family's orbit. Thomas's rage held its own weight, a grudge born of years of witnessing his parents' lives disintegrate because Ridge never truly chose. Ridge had failed Taylor far too many times, according to Thomas, and that failure had now evolved into something darker. Thomas attacked Ridge with venomous words, each accusation cutting deeper than the previous. He branded him selfish, cowardly, and weak. He accused him of using love as an excuse to harm everyone who had ever cared about him. Ridge attempted to defend himself, explaining that what had occurred was a mistake, that it stemmed from perplexity and weakness rather than love. But Thomas would not hear it. To him, his mother had always come second to Brooke, and even now, when pregnant, she would be seen as the woman Ridge looked to when Brooke was no longer within reach. Thomas's wrath was directed not only at his mother, but also at himself as a child who had grown up in the shadow of this unrelenting triangle. Brooke's anguish grew when she noticed the lines of pain carved into Thomas's face. She couldn't take solace in his fury because it was tinged with contempt for her. She was the impediment, the reason his mother grieved, and the reason his family was divided. Brooke wanted to tell him that she, too, was crushed, that Ridge's betrayal had cut her as deeply as it had hurt Taylor, but Thomas refused to see her sorrow as equal. To him, she was an intruder, the source of an endless circle of heartbreak. Ridge stood between them all, his shoulders down and his gaze haunted. He was torn in all directions, unable to comprehend the devastation he had caused. He loved Brooke wholeheartedly, yet his actions betrayed that love. He cared about Taylor, respected her, and possibly even loved her in some lingering manner that he couldn't express without jeopardizing Brooke's trust. And now there was a child, an innocent life caught up in a war neither of them could win. Brooke couldn't sleep. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling in circles. She remembered every delicate moment with Ridge, every whispered word, and every embrace that had made her feel safe. Now those recollections were polluted, infected with mistrust. Were those lies? Were those touches borrowed when he still yearns for someone else? She couldn't get the vision of Taylor carrying his kid, her body shining with a promise Brooke could never equal. The anguish hit her in waves, each one pushing her further into despair.